discussion. So we may be calling on you, Derek, for sure to participate in that discussion. You can stick around.
Yeah,
Great. Emilio?
Yes, I will stop sharing the poll and I will move to the next speaker. Thank you. So for the next two short talks, we have Amarina Wuenschel, as a Forest Service ecologist in the Pacific Southwest Regional Ecology Program for the Sierra Sequoia and Inyo National Forests. She's focused on communicating and applying science information and ecological monitoring. She's also the DINKIM Collaborative Monitoring Coordinator and leading to the Creek Fire Restoration Project in the Sierra National Forest. And after that, we'll have Malcolm North. He's a research forest ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, Pacific Southwest, and also an affiliate professor at UC Davis. I want to point this out. He received his PhD at the University of Washington, so go Huskies. His research includes working on examining forest restoration and ecosystem response, wildfire, and forest carbon dynamics. So Amarina, you can take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about a climate-wise reforestation toolkit that a number of us worked on. I'm mostly going to be navigating through the tool, so if you want to go there in your Google browser, I recommend it. I think Kelly's going to put the link in the chat for you. So this is something that I worked on. As Amelia said, I work with the Forest Service Region 5 Ecology Program. I want to especially acknowledge Zach Steele with UC Berkeley, who did the coding work for this, and Mark Meyer, who led the project. He's also with the R5 Ecology Program. And Stephen Asoy with the USDA Climate Hub, and Malcolm North also contributed to this project. So
Marina, you might want to put that in presentation mode. We're seeing it as not in presentation. There we go.
Thank you. I was just going to navigate to the tool itself.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry.
So our reforestation toolkit here has three main components. The first is a prioritization tool. The next, a stand summary tool, and then a best management practices guide. There's also this sort of about page and a technical info page. I'm going to start with the prioritization tool. Before I really get into it, I'll explain sort of why we decided to build this in the first place. So, you know, as tree mortality was happening, you know, a lot of our coworkers in the Forest Service were wondering, like, what can we do? How can we fix this? How can we manage our way out of this? I feel like that's, you know, sometimes our neurosis as Forest Service managers is we want to be able to fix this. But of course, this happened at such a large scale and it happened so suddenly, you know, it's really difficult to be able to really touch a lot of the landscape. So we wanted to come up with a way to start thinking about how to prioritize it. We also wanted to sort of just get people to look at the broader landscape rather than sort of the pet project areas that we tend to go to. And we also wanted to use this as a sort of a conversation starter, like a way for people to talk about where our values were when it came to where we plant. So I'm going to walk you through this tool. The first step is to select a landscape of interest. This is definitely very Forest Service biased. All these are national forests and ranger districts. I'm going to select the Bass Lake Ranger District because I'm talking to you from here today. And my extreme apologies if my internet goes out. It's usually stable, but we've been having storms. The next step after you select your landscape of interest is to decide which mortality threshold that you'd consider reforesting after. And this comes from the LEMA data from Oregon State. So I'm going to select 30%. If there's 30% of the stand that has died according to this data, then I want to consider reforesting after. Then the next data set that we brought into this is mechanical constraints data. This comes from a project that Malcolm North led. And it just basically shows like where we can work because it's not a wilderness area, and where we can work because we can get there because there's roads there, and where the slopes are gentle enough. And so there's sort of a conservative option and a more liberal option. And by the way, too, you can check these layers out on the map as you're walking through this. And then these next layers really get at sort of the values piece I mentioned earlier. So drought risk, habitat areas, recreation areas. They're all normalized. So the idea being that the user can slide these scale bars and select how they want them to be weighted in the output of the priority analysis. And at the end, all these rasters are summed. And so the first one is drought risk, and this is coming from the climatic water deficit data. And I think this is a good way to think about how we might want to be replanting in the face of climate change. But if you slide the scale to the right, then you would want to be selecting for the wetter sites where you might have a higher probability of maintaining forests into the future. The next one is high severity fire core areas. So there are better tools out there now to prioritize within fire footprints, but this is if you wanted to look at these within the whole landscape. Wildland urban interface, perhaps you want to prioritize planting around where people live, same with recreation areas. The two habitat features here are spotted owls and fisher. I like the way these are done here. You can slide the bar toward one if you want to plant in these areas. These species tend to like trees. Or you can deprioritize them because sometimes it's contentious to work in these areas. So you might want to say, I want to get this fuels project done and quickly. We have resources now, so I don't want to spend a lot of time in planning. So I'm going to avoid these areas. And then you can calculate the output. So while it's calculating, I'll just say I really like the way that Zach coded this with the sliding bars. I think it's a really intuitive way for people to kind of select their priorities, but it also allows them a lot of control. And then the output you can see on the map here are the priority areas for planting. And then you get a graph of where they are according to vegetation types and the hectares of priority planting. Uh-oh. The next part of this that I'm going to go over is the best management practices guide. So this comes from work done by Malcolm, mostly done by Malcolm North, called the TAM Review paper, the Reforestation for Resilience. And I know he's talking next, so I'm not going to get into it, but I highly recommend you checking this out on the tool. And then the last piece I'm going to cover is this post-drought stand condition summary tool. And actually, Derek just introduced that he was the lead on two of the papers that have come out of this project that a number of us worked on. He looked at treated and untreated areas and how they fared in the drought mortality. And so we display this data here for people to check out. And this is especially, I think, valuable early on, right after tree mortality had happened, just because the conditions had changed so suddenly. So this allows people to check out the data by where the plots are, as well as to check out. Can people still hear me? It seems like my internet just went out on the tool.
You're
I
fine.
can hear you, yep.
Okay, so I'll just skip that because the tool seems to, the internet maybe isn't good enough to run through that for you right now, but basically one of the pieces of that stand summary tool was that you could see basically what Derek brought up earlier was that in most places natural regeneration seemed fairly adequate. The places that we were most concerned about were the highest mortality areas, and we were concerned about pines because of all the overstory pine mortality. There's no real future seed source in some of these places, and there wasn't a lot of pine regeneration. When I was putting this presentation together, I started thinking about this presentation that I just gave last year in the spring to one of the National Forest leadership teams. They wanted to know about prioritizing after tree mortality. And so I presented the data from that study, including the natural regeneration data. And they asked me, so how much would you prioritize reforesting in these areas of tree mortality? And I said, well, after reviewing all the data sets from the study, the fuel loading data that we have was just really something else. And I know that a lot of the presentations covered this yesterday, and they covered this in more detail, but essentially, given these fuel loadings that we're seeing on these forests, and these predictions that these scientists have, and I mean Stevens et al, that we're going to get mega fires because we have these vast and continuous fuel sources. That's my concern for reforestation. If we get these big fires, we're definitely going to have a reforestation need. And of course, that happened in the province that I cover for the Forest Service. I think we had about 550,000 acres of mega fire. So this image here, that's the Creek Fire. You're seeing the postscript model. I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but it basically predicts where natural regeneration is probable after a fire and where it's not. And the darker brown areas indicate the areas where we think that there's going to be regeneration failure within areas that were formerly forests. So now I don't necessarily see people using the reforestation toolkit I just showed you to prioritize where to go. At least in the area I work, we know where to go. We're going to go to these big fire, high severity core areas. Although I do see some utility in that tool in order to sort of bring the mortality thinking into this picture, because the fact that we've had tree mortality and then these big fires, that sort of adds a whole new element, and these post-fire models don't incorporate tree mortality yet. And on that note, I'm just going to point to a few new resources out there to help us think about restoration, reforestation after fire. So the first is a GTR that just came out, the Post-Fire Restoration Framework for National Forests in California. It's just a guide to structure the way people sort of work through thinking about restoration, reforestation after fire. The next is Postscript. A lot of brilliant minds worked on this, including Kristen Shive, who's with the Nature Conservancy, and more recently, Joseph Stewart and Micah Wright worked to make this into this great tool, like web-based tool. And the link is there, and I can drop it in the chat box after the presentation. And then finally, there's presets. So this is something that Derek Young worked on along with Quinn Sorensen and Andrew Latimer from UC Davis, which predicts planting benefit and shrub cover. And so that is all. Thank you very much for the time today. And I'll pass it back to Emilio.
Thank you so much, Amarina. All right. Malcolm, you should be able to share your screen now.